The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted business operations nationally, with more employees working home or remotely. This shift in operations and increase in residential demand has further amplified the need for affordable energy and a reliable and resilient energy grid. As we continue to experience an increase in weather-related events, the industry is investing significant capital to build a more resilient and reliable grid. The next panel will discuss in detail the industry's efforts to address these issues. The panel is comprised of 3 industry CFOs and other thought leaders in the sector. Their remarks will focus on clean energy technologies needed to meet state and company goals, lessons learned, opportunities for improvement, and the leading role utilities will play in this clean energy transition. This discussion will be led by Vrins, Segment Leader of Energy, Sustainability, and Infrastructure at Guidehouse. He will be joined by Andrejka Bernatova, Chief Financial Officer of Enchanted Rock, Drew Marsh, the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at Entergy, and Maria Rigatti, Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of Edison International. During this panel, the chat feature will be open, so please forward any questions you may have to the panel.
Thanks, Dan, for introducing our panel. This will be an exciting discussion topic with great panelists today. When we think about resiliency, it's important to recognize different types of resiliency and time horizons. For today's discussion, I want to recognize 3 resiliency challenges that we are facing as an industry today. The first one is immediate challenges. And I'm sure Maria and Drew will talk about some of the immediate resiliency challenges they have with hurricanes, wildfires, cyber attacks. We need utilities to prepare, restore, and recover. Hardening security measures are being put in place. It's a resiliency challenge that we have right now. Medium term, as the grid is changing, as we get more smart technologies, distributed energy resources, and intermittent resources on the grid, we also need to warrant resiliency as we continue to support our customers. And then long-term resiliency, when we talk about decarbonization goals and pathways, goals 10, 20 years from now that many of the utilities represented today and at this conference have set is going to be important as well. As we look forward, the challenges to make our energy infrastructure more resilient has significantly increased with the emerging energy cloud, where a cleaner, intelligent, distributed, and more equitable energy system is required to address climate change, cyber and physical disruptions, and new customer needs. All this while keeping the lights on and stoves burning, with safety, reliability, and affordability being table stakes at best. Today we'll discuss the leading role of utilities as they go through energy transformation, safeguard resiliency of our energy system. We will start also with some questions with regard to the challenges utilities are facing right now as it pertains to the COVID pandemic. Then we'll move on to the medium and long-term resiliency challenges that we just discussed and impacts for utilities. So with that, Maria, I'm going to have you answer the first question, which is, how has COVID-19 impacted load, and how are you dealing with the inevitable affordability issues that your customers are facing?
Yeah, so I think, as we started into really the deep part of the pandemic, the governor here in California issued some stay-at-home orders, some work-at-home orders. We had everyone working from home. We had folks who were teaching their children from home, very similar to other parts of the country. And initially, I think we had an experience that most people had, or most utilities had. Residential loads were higher, commercial loads were lower. And at the very initial stages, we probably had low single-digit reductions in load as a result of all of those changes. Load is very susceptible to weather, and so as we've gone through the rest of this summer and it's been warmer here recently, we've actually seen some mitigation of that, and we haven't seen a tremendous necessarily impact on load from the pandemic. I will say though that that doesn't mean that our customers aren't feeling the impact. especially the economic impact of COVID. And so we've been very focused here also on how do we alleviate those impacts, not just, how do we manage the load variation. California has a long history of trackers, so any variations we would have around load or sales was definitely going to be covered by our existing trackers. The commission here in California from the get-go put a disconnect moratorium in place. In fact, it's one of the longest ones in the US. It's stretches out now until next April. And so that really helped customers from an economic perspective. Again, we had trackers, so from a utility perspective, it was very manageable. But the one other thing that California did and that we were very supportive of and very involved in is we actually had legislation passed, just recently signed by the governor, that will allow us to securitize those changes in load or those increases in bad debt expense. And again, from a utility perspective, we would be able to start recovering any of those costs starting next year, but that could be a pretty significant impact on our customers. And so this legislation that was just passed goes right to the heart of affordability and will allow us, subject to the amounts being material, will allow us to securitize that over a much longer term. So I think there was definitely a focus both on what was happening with the utilities, but then also what was happening with our customers.
Thanks, Maria. And Drew, how is Entergy dealing with the pandemic and the impacts on your customers?
Well, thanks. And many of the things that Maria was talking about are circumstances that we're dealing with as well. We have seen some changes with our load. We did not have the same kind of heat that California had for sure this summer. We had different kinds of challenges. We launched our pandemic plan, our pandemic response plan early this year, like many utilities. And we've been running by that playbook since the very beginning. And that has caused us to have to do things a little bit differently than what we normally would. But we put that into action with things like storm response, nuclear outages. We've had to plan very differently in the way that we operate during the course of the year. And some of the things that Maria was talking about in regards to customers, we've also been implementing. Obviously, there's been disconnects, moratoriums in our states as well. And we've been working on customer payment plans to help our customers manage better as well. And all of that is under regulatory orders that allow us to get recovery for bad debt expense and pandemic costs, similar to California. We have the opportunity to securitize in Louisiana. We don't get all the way to load differentials, but we do get some of the bad debt expense and the extra incremental costs are able to be recovered in that way. So those are some of the ways that we're dealing with it. But probably I'll say one of the most important things that we're dealing with it is we are flexing our spending quite a bit this year, and we've talked about reducing our expenses by over $100 million this year, and we've been on target to meet or exceed that opportunity. And so that's been a big part of our response to help our customers keep their costs down going forward as well.
Thanks, Drew. And back to Maria, if you now look at the pandemic in the context of resiliency, and obviously we all are very aware of the wildfires throughout the West Coast, which is really awful for your customers, and I'm sure a huge challenge for all the utilities on the West Coast. How do you now look at the pandemic with the wildfires through the lens of reliability and resiliency? What challenges do you see there, and what are you as a utility doing about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And certainly the pandemic has had an impact on how we approach that. Not so much from the types of work that we do, but really it's impacted the way we interact with our communities. We have a lot of really critical risk management work that we need to do, whether that's hardening the grid or whether that's requiring some public safety power shutoffs to mitigate risk in the near term. And when we started dealing with the pandemic, we knew again that our customers who were now at home more than ever were going to be highly sensitive to any sort of outages that we wanted to take. And so we started from the get-go. Drew mentioned, standing up a team and having a playbook. We had a similar team that was stood up to deal with this the way we would deal with any other business resiliency issue. And that team immediately went into production with protocols to reach out to our local communities, to deal with their concerns. We also had strong support from our regulator. In fact, the CPUC and Cal OES and Cal Fire sent a joint letter to our communities telling them that the critical work, the essential work, the wildfire mitigation work had to continue notwithstanding the pandemic. Granted, we had to make some adjustments too. And so, thinking about increasing the size of the crew so that we could get the work done more quickly, maybe taking the outages overnight, some backup generation if it was going to affect a large number of customers. All of that had to be worked through, but we knew we had to do it. I think what it really affected was our communication, our protocols, our outreach, and our engagement with our communities made that more important than ever. So that's how I think the COVID-19 situation has been impacting sort of the near term. And happily for us, it hasn't been an impact. We've been able to manage through it.
Thanks, Maria. And back to you, Drew. Entergy has had their share of hurricanes already in this season, and we're probably halfway the hurricane season. How have you dealt with resiliency, reliability, working through damage of hurricanes, impact on customers within this pandemic, Drew?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have had to operate differently, as I mentioned a minute ago. That's meant different protocols in the way that we, for example, storm response, where you're talking about hurricanes. We've had to enact different protocols that allow us to spread people out. Normally we would have people, for example, perhaps a couple of workers per room. We can't do that. We had to make it one per room. We've had to set up more camps, and it's led to more expense, to the tune of maybe a couple $100 million this year associated with storm response expenses. And that's part of that's the lodging piece. Part of that is additional PP&E and so forth. But that's how we've had to deal with it, is through changing our protocols. And sometimes that's a little bit more expensive, but certainly a much safer way to do things.
Thanks, Drew. So shifting beyond the immediate resiliency issues in the midst of a pandemic that utilities are working through. Andrejka, I want to switch to you. Enchanted Rock is in the business of resiliency, right? Providing resiliency solutions to your customers. What are customers asking for, Andrejka? Is it resiliency by itself? Is it green energy? Is it reliability? Is it more control over behind the meter solutions, storage, distributed generation? And then secondly, what new strategies for the way you engage with clients have you guys learned to be very effective?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. For us, the pandemic and obviously the rise of extreme weather events that puts more sort of light on our business and the need for resiliency. That's our sole purpose. And it really has been all of the above that you mentioned. It is a focus on resiliency, number one, obviously. Number two, focus on costs. And we do provide your dual purpose solution, meaning grid stability as well as resiliency. And so it allows for the customers for lower cost solution than they would otherwise be able to get to. Really over the past year, we have seen quite an increase in focus on green solution. So we do have natural gas fleet, and we are looking at other solutions in terms of fuel that really is able to provide, carbon neutral or carbon negative really solution for some of the bigger customers. So when you think about some of the smaller, maybe groceries or smaller hospitals, focus there is obviously on cost and resiliency. When you think about some of the bigger customers like the data centers or some of the large, grocery chains and some of the large utilities, municipalities, the green solution is very, very important. Now, what does it mean for our customer interaction, both current customers as well as future, is generally we would interact sort of on the mid levels with folks that are dealing with the outages or are focused on solving the sort of resilience issues. The conversations are now moving to the boardrooms and to the C-suite. And it is driven, again, by the clean and the ESG push, even for our side of, resiliency side of the business. So quite a lot of changes. I would say number 3 is growing with customers across geographies. So while before a year ago we would be more local, we now see customers wanting a longer term multi-year resiliency programs, which really wasn't sort of the selection or the thought before. So longer term planning, certainly cleaner for some customers, and dealing not only with sort of the folks that are dealing with the outages on the ground, but also with the boardroom and C-suite discussions.
That's great, Andrejka. And Maria, I know Edison International thinks a lot about how to engage with customers. Very aggressive climate goals in California. Many of your large commercial industrial customers are thinking about green energy. I know you guys are thinking about that. What are things that you see from your perspective in the way you engage with your customers are changing and are becoming effective in terms of addressing their needs? And it must not be easy, right? They want reliability, they want the lowest cost, they want resiliency, they want green, they want it on site. So it's quite a challenge.
Well, it certainly is. I think, and I would echo all the things that Andrejka said, because even through our advisory service business that we own, we're seeing all of the same trends that were just discussed. And I think within SCE service territory, it's been a long time where customers have wanted more green energy. They want that clean energy strategy. If you look at all of the surveys that are done in California, year after year, decade after decade, there's a strong support for these strategies. And we continue to see just more renewables. At this point, I think we have about 8% of our residential customers have rooftop solar, and another 1,000 megawatts of solar that our commercial and industrial customers own. We think by the time we get to 2045, that'll be 50% of our customers will have rooftop storage. That'll be accompanied by behind the meter storage, and it's just, I think, going to be a landscape where you have more and more distributed energy resources. I think in terms of engagement with our customers, one of the really important things is going to be to engage on affordability, and that's going to require communication. If we think about getting to that, the goals that California has, and they're very aggressive goals, as you've said, how do we do that in the most cost-effective manner? I think the most cost-effective manner from our perspective is, further electrification of the economy. If that happens, we actually think affordability will benefit, and that customers will see a 30% increase in the energy share of wallet that they're experiencing. But that doesn't mean their electric bill is going to go down. Their electric bill will actually go up, and other energy utilization will go down. So we need to be on the front end of communicating that change and what it means. And I think the other thing that we're going to have to really engage on is to make sure that all of our communities can take part in this, energy transformation, if you will. We can't leave disadvantaged communities behind. We know that's important from a community perspective. We know that our regulators are incredibly focused on that. And so I think it's all of the above. We have to engage with our commercial customers and help them meet their needs and help them kind of understand what their needs are sometimes, but then also we have to think about this affordability issue more broadly. And I think that's going to be an important point of engagement for us.
And Maria, do you believe that the affordability with the equality and let's say greening, energy for your customers, you guys see that going hand in hand, as part of your strategy?
Absolutely. We absolutely think it can be done. We think we can focus on all of our communities, not just the more affluent communities that probably up until now have really benefited from that. If you think about it, when you think about the amount of the increase in energy usage and electric usage over the years, we probably see sort of flat load between now and 2030. But then between 2030 and 2045, we see a 65% or 60% increase in energy sales between those two periods. As that happens, we can really start, that has a benefit across the board. Costs will be spread out more. It will require some rate design thought. We don't want to cost shift between different customer classes. So it's not that there's a solve in this particular moment in terms of exactly what rate design will look like, but I think that we have all the piece parts that will ensure that all of our customers benefit.
That's great. Thanks, Maria. And Drew, let's switch to another, a group of stakeholders that you as a CFO deal with on a day-to-day basis. So your shareholders and your investors. What are they expecting with regard to long-term climate risk and adaptation? How important has the E of environment become as part of ESG, environment, social, and governance?
That's a good question. It's become very important over the last few years. We're well positioned because we were actually the first ones to cap greenhouse gases back in 2000, and we've changed that several times. And then, of course, as you alluded to earlier, we have a goal of 50% reduction by 2030, and then net zero by 2050, similar to some others. So we feel like we're well on that path. And that is something that investors certainly want to hear about. We've been doing it for a long time, so we have one of the cleanest fleets in the country. But it's still something that's very, very important, and we talk about it all the time. The other parts I think are also important. The S and the G, that we hear about those much more than we used to. But of course, investors always want to know that you're going to maintain your earnings growth, you're going to maintain your dividend growth, you're going to maintain your balance sheet. So some of the things that you all were just talking about in terms of customers, the reliability, the sustainability, the affordability, they're actually wanting to hear about all those things as it relates to ESG. And they want to hear about how we are engaging in stakeholder capitalism, but keeping an eye on the earnings and the dividend growth at the same time.
Welcome to the world of the CFO. Thanks, Drew. Maria, in your case, similar, more discussion with, more pressure from shareholders and investors to work on not only ESG but environment as a big part of the company's future.
Absolutely. I think, more and more we're hearing from our investors around the E and the S and the G. So yes, clearly important. I think that one of the things that really strikes me, though, is it's not simply important to our shareholders, it's important to all of our stakeholders. And I think that's beneficial. People are starting to all align around what's important, and then ultimately, what creates the most value in the long term for the company. So if you think about it, investors are focused on ESG. They're looking at ways for all companies to report on a more consistent basis so they can actually look at similar frameworks across different entities. Regulators, we have a proceeding open here in California all about climate adaptation. So they're focused on it. We know that legislators are focused on it. So I think it's actually, there's a growing recognition, not just in our shareholder base, but in all of our other stakeholders, that the E is important, that mitigating the risk around climate adaptation and climate risk is really important, and that having strong, financially stable utilities is also really important to deliver the outcomes that the state and the customer wants, and then in turn, that's going to deliver the sorts of value that our shareholders want. So it's a very holistic kind of approach that we're starting to see.
Yeah, and we've been talking about it for a while now within the industry, and we particularly believe that there's a tremendous important role for utilities, not only to drive policy and regulation forward, at the same time provide the services and the expansion of new products and service to your customers as well. Definitely not an easy job, but I think we think that utilities are in the best position to become leaders and orchestrators of the energy system of the future. Mm-hmm. So let's switch gears, Andrejka, and I'm coming to you now. Next question is about technologies. Obviously, your organization constantly looks at new technologies for for customers to provide resiliency, greener energy solutions, etc. What are some of the winning technologies that you see that address resiliency of our energy system? Is it renewables? Is it storage? Is it renewable gas like green hydrogen? Any others? What are you guys seeing in terms of the winning technologies?
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting environment, I think, for all of us over the next few years, sort of looking at the different technologies and deciding who are going to be, winners and losers in the process. I would say one important aspect, again, that we do see across the board for our customers, and some of them want to own it, and some of them are okay if, an infrastructure partner owns it on their behalf, but it's certainly the dual purpose microgrid, right? So the ability for the grid stability, selling into the grid and generating revenues from that side, as well as obviously the resiliency piece. So that underlines anything that we do in our business now and for the future. The second component, it is what you mentioned, Jan. It's really the ability to interact next to solar and interact next to storage and essentially provide resiliency that's fully integrated together with these essentially two other solutions. So that's something that Enchanted Rock is looking at actively right now on how do we want to play it and exactly execute on it for our customers. But it is going to be not necessarily picking the winning technology, but working with multiple different technologies to solve different problems. For some customers, it could be just the generation and the storage. For others, it's going to be solar and generation. And so it will be every situation will be different. We haven't sort of placed a bet on the fuel source, if you will, but we are looking at a number of options, and the most natural one probably will be the renewable natural gas one. And we have made a transition over the years from diesel to natural gas, and so we are now looking at where is the most natural transition for us as the next step. So, we have done this before and looking to the next step, but a lot of different technologies that we are looking at. I think the other component is how do you sort of integrate it into your business? Do you acquire? Do you do JV? Do you grow it internally, organically? So I think those are going to be other important components on how companies are solving resiliency. There's a lot of software options, a lot of infrastructure options floating around. And so that's, again, something we are looking at. What's the best way to actually execute on it from a growth perspective?
Yeah, so Enchanted Rock is a partner to utilities, right? And maybe even in these microgrid solutions, pulling in other either technology or hardware providers as well in that partner, in those joint venture partnerships that you're talking about, right, Andrejka?
Yes, absolutely. We've had a number of partnerships with utilities. We are working on a couple of new ones, and so it's a very much of a symbiotic relationship. We've studied the market, or studying the scale of the market as we speak, and we estimate that in the next 10 years, there's going to be somewhere around 250 billion in terms of capital need for resiliency. And so obviously that requires sort of hands on deck across all of us that are on this panel and a lot of other players. So I think there's going to be a lot of symbiotic relationships here with the utilities, certainly.
And a follow-on for you as well, Andrejka. Are there certain sectors that you see are leading the way? Is it retailers? Maybe some local government? What are some of the sectors where you see, these behind the meter microgrid, integrated solutions to provide resiliency? Where do you see them being adapted right now?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jan. It's obviously an evolving playing field here. We started really with, years ago with sort of smaller municipalities and water utilities and others, and small retailers, small retail shops, etc. And then we entered sort of the bigger grocery chains and retail chains. What we actually have seen recently is the hospitals and senior living facilities. We actually entered that sector before the pandemic, and we've worked with hospitals way before the pandemic on those solutions. It's slowed down for a couple of months, as you can imagine, as they were saving lives very near term. But we really have seen quite a pickup in the healthcare sector. And the second sector, I think that what we've seen sort of a growth on a just absolute scale level is the data centers. And so traditionally, you see a diesel fleet with the data centers. We do see, and we are trying to educate the industry on the need for natural gas and other sources. And they certainly are interested in green solutions, just because they are, large quantity users. And so I would say that data centers is probably going to be a big driver of our space in terms of resiliency.
Yeah, and the fuel question is so important. We've been looking at behind the meter resiliency solutions for many years, and we've seen a clear uptick again to address resiliency. But a lot of the fuel sources there were carbon-based fuels still. So at the same time, when we put on more generators and solutions behind the meter that are powered by carbon fuels, it will obviously not help our sustainability and climate goals. So the area of and I'm coming to you, Drew. The area of fuels, right? We've obviously switched and are still switching from coal to natural gas that has reduced carbon emissions in North America. What's next from a fuel perspective? I know Entergy has done research and more than research, I must say, on the topic of renewable gas and hydrogen. Can you share a little bit more how you guys are looking at electric versus a switch from natural gas to renewable gas, longer term, Drew?
Sure. We are doing a number of things. That includes what you're talking about, going to potentially renewable gas. We're also looking at our new CCGTs that we are considering, one over in Texas right now on an RFP. We're looking to see if it can actually burn hydrogen. And through our partnership that we just announced with Mitsubishi, that goes over 10 years, we're exploring that, the 30% option and the potential to go to 100% down the road. And there are other technologies out there, carbon capture, small modular reactors. Each one of them has either technical challenges or sustainability challenges now. Even batteries are a real opportunity, and the costs continue to come down, but to get to the scale that we need on the utility is going to be really big challenge. So one of those technologies, or perhaps a combination of all of them, is what it's going to take to get to a net zero in 2050. And certainly in the near term, natural gas is going to be a very important feature for managing the grid overall. But to get to net zero, we're going to have to find a way to manage against that.
Great. And Maria, I know Edison International has developed pathways, and you guys have been doing that for a while now. Electrification is a big part of that, including electrification of electric vehicles. But I think you also recognize that there might be a role for a renewable gas to kind of get to 100%. Do you want to share something about that? And then secondly, Andrejka mentioned microgrids, right? And obviously in California, is microgrid something that could help the energy system in California, also from a resiliency perspective, and maybe even from a climate perspective, Maria?
Yeah, it's interesting. You're right. We've been really developing our thoughts around this for a number of years. First we had the pathway to 2030, now we have the pathway to 2045, and it definitely relies on a much broader electrification of the economy, more renewables, more storage, utility scale renewables, about 80 gigs, storage 30. So it's a very broad reliance on that sort of technology. But we do recognize that from an affordability perspective, there's still going to be some gas in the mix, and lower carbon gas, renewable natural gas. But by the time we get to 2045, just to keep that kind of wrapper around affordability, we still think that about 6% of generation will likely be gas-fired, again, renewable natural gas-fired. I think it's important. The commission here is actually looking at a proceeding that kind of tries to figure out what are the things to do around the gas system to ensure ongoing reliability, even though the utilization will go down over time. So we think that it's important just to keep that on the radar. Microgrids are an interesting area. We've looked at them a lot from the perspective of just wildfires and how do you serve remote communities that might otherwise be the subject of a power shutoff if the risk becomes too high. I think there are different use cases. Sometimes it's at the very end of the line. Maybe that's a place to put it. Sometimes it's really around small microgrids to serve really key loads, so that when we do have to turn off the power, they can still be served. I think we're still exploring what the optimal uses of a microgrid might be, though.
Okay, thanks, Maria. And yeah, I want to add a couple of perspectives. I think with regard to electric versus gas, I think every region, every state will be different, right? There's a huge difference between California from a load perspective and from a demand perspective, and the Northeast. Specifically, if you think about the winter, for example, and a lot of the heating in the Northeast is still obviously based on natural gas. I'm from the Netherlands, and we actually have done a significant innovation now around injecting hydrogen into a natural gas supply up to 20% without making any changes to the pipeline infrastructure or the appliances on in the homes or in the factories, which is quite interesting. So I do want to recognize that the regional approaches might be different across North America, across the world as well. And then the last thing in terms of winning technologies, we haven't spoken about it, but I personally think that offshore wind will be important for the US as a whole as well. Again, it will be different by region. Obviously, Maria, you guys have so much renewables, so you might not onshore, you might not look at offshore, but definitely for the Northeast again, in the North Sea in Europe, we're building 180 gigawatts of offshore wind. Combine that with hydrogen production at sea, where then hydrogen gets pumped into pipelines into a hydrogen network in Europe, and I'm sure in the US we need something like that as well. I hope we really, as an industry, have those discussions and innovate our energy system, because other regions are definitely doing it, and we don't want to stay behind. By the way, switching topics, more a CFO topic, if you will. Although I always joke about the role of the CFO, which has kind of become a chief of everything. When I hear CFO talk about the business now, you guys know so much about the business, and the financial part, seems to be becoming smaller and smaller in your role, which is an interesting thought altogether. But from a strategic investment perspective, how is your company dealing with the different resiliency challenges, weather events, cyber attacks, and then the time horizons, right? The immediate ones, the midterm, because you still want to do grid modernization, you still have to integrate DER, you still have to integrate renewables, intermittent renewables, storage. How have your investment plans changed specifically? And let me start with Drew. I know you have thought a lot about this. How do you balance, your investment plan along those three dimensions of resiliency, short, mid, and long term, Drew?
Yeah, that's a challenge, because it's sort of all of the above of what you're talking about are things that we want to invest in. In fact, I haven't yet come across an engineer that didn't have an opportunity to invest a lot of money in the grid somewhere. But there are opportunities for us all along. But I would say that the two main things that we're thinking about right now, well, probably on the heels of storm, there's probably three, with with hardening along the coast. So that's become a topic again more recently. But the two main things that we've been thinking about are the renewables investment opportunity. And in our service territory, there isn't as much wind, but we do have some sun. And so the solar opportunity has taken off around here. And, you know, I wish that we could do offshore like you were talking about, Jan, but it's just not that windy unless it gets really too windy offshore Louisiana. But you know, we are looking at that and a number of ways that we can structure our investments in order to take advantage of tax credits and so forth. The other place that we are looking at is much closer to the customer, and that includes a lot of distribution investment. That includes DER investment. Includes partnerships with folks like Andrejka at Enchanted Rock, and we actually did one of the grocery stores that she was talking about earlier with them over in Texas. So investments much closer to the customer, and those are the two focus areas for us. And we, in particular around the customer, we set up Keystring Labs to go make investments on nearer to the customer, and that includes shore power and the discussion around microgrids. You know, that's electrifying our ports and electrifying boats, allowing them to plug in whenever they come into shore, and that actually matches up with new environmental regulations that they are facing when they are docked. Gives them a chance to, you know, work their equipment, and it's actually cheaper and cleaner for them going forward. And we actually, to support those customers, we're putting in microgrid type solutions down near the coast because, as Maria said, one of the use cases is sort of the end of the line customer. And so we found that as well. So we're finding ways to put these things to work, you know, innovative battery solutions. We used a battery as a black start unit, essentially, for one of our combined cycles up in northern Louisiana. And we believe that was the first use of a battery for that purpose. And it's got a small generator, which was another thing that Andrejka was talking about. We have a small generator that can help charge the battery in the event that there's, you know, an extended outage or something like that. So we found different ways to incorporate technologies, but, you know, there is the renewable side at one end of the value chain, and at the other end of the value chain are a lot of customer-centric investments that we're looking for.
So two questions, Drew, follow-on questions with regard to that the customer investments, right? One is your shareholders and investors, you know, were used to a model where you would invest in power plants, right? Central station power plants, transmission lines, distribution networks, right? That was, you know, traditionally, you know, the investments that you had on your investment plan. So now you're adding the customer, you know, investments. I love that term, by the way, Drew. How do your investors and shareholders look at that? One, and then two is, do you see more shared investment as well there, Drew? So investments that a utility does with customers jointly, or even with, you know, cities and communities, right, to address, you know, some of the objectives in terms of, you know, not only resiliency but also climate goals. So two-part question there, Drew, for you.
Yeah, sure. So I'll answer the second part first. We think there's a lot of opportunity to partner with our customers. In fact, in the example of our Enchanted Rock partnership, we made the investment jointly with the customer. And if you think about backup generation that it's customer sited, it's the perfect match between the customer and the utility, because, you know, when the grid is down, the customer can use the backup supply and have the resilience that the customer wants. But that is very rare, right? 99.99% of the time the grid is up. So what are they going to do with that asset the rest of the time? Well, if the utility can have access and call to that asset, we could potentially put it back to the grid. Or if we need a more local solution, we could take the customer off the grid. There are a lot of opportunities there that the utility can actually begin to partner up with the customer to do different things, to meet the customer's needs, to tailor to the customer solutions. And that, you know, that's an example of how the shore power piece came along as well. And there are many other examples that we are uncovering around energy efficiency and solar power and other things that we are looking to partner with our customers on. And to go back to your first question about how investors think about it, I think they're pretty excited about it, because the way I think about it, if you're putting in a transmission line, well, that's a traditional investment and your customers are going to pay for it. But if you can find a way to partner with a specific customer, you can expand in a way that's very different than just traditional rate base, because you have the opportunity to create revenue, which is not just rate-based revenue. It's coming in from a different source because you're providing a different level of service. So that's pretty exciting, and it gives us an opportunity to perhaps grow beyond the specific rate-based model, but still within the rate-regulated framework.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and yes, I think if investors and shareholders, are embracing this as well. Obviously, the timelines are different, right? The amounts are different, but if they really embrace that new future, a business model where you develop those customer solutions jointly, yeah, that's really exciting to hear. Maria, same question for you. How have your investment plans changed? And I know you guys have been working on it for a while, so I don't think that's something as of late. But where have your plans changed, and where do you see them changing going forward, even more so?
No, I think it's a really interesting way you phrase the question. So the immediate, the midterm, and the longer term. And I know we can definitely think about it that way. I would say, though, that from my perspective, those three time horizons are very interrelated. So, in the near term, in the immediate term, obviously, we're thinking about wildfire risk mitigation. That continues to build on all of the infrastructure replacement that we have been talking about for years and years. So again, I'll say the newer thing, the more immediate thing, building on something from the past. And wildfire mitigation, though, is going to address grid hardening. It's going to address increasing sectionalization of our wires and of our circuits. It's going to look at things that really enhance resiliency today and mitigate risk today, but also are sort of a bedrock for the go forward. We've been working on grid mod for a while as well, and you might think about grid mod as more of a medium term thing, because we continue to roll that out. We have about probably more than $600 million of capital in our current rate case that starts in 2021, and that's aimed at so many things that are going to be important for the long term. So that's around communication networks, that's around cybersecurity, which is really key. More automation, more sensors, all of that. Much bigger focus on cybersecurity. So that also creates, a foundation then for even the longer term. And when I think about the longer term, I think again about how does the grid need to change? All of those investments that we've been making all along, and then investments like that going forward, are still going to be important. And we think there's a long runway for that type of investment. But how do you think about grid design, and how do you think about customer needs? And will customer needs change? The urban customer, the transportation corridor impact, microgrids, as we said before. Even we had some rotating outages here in California. Even our planning assumptions, the ones that will stick in the long term. Now, these are things that we have to work with, other stakeholders and, the regulator and the independent system operator on. But, is the 1 in 10 planning scenario still the right one as people think more about resiliency and reliability? Are the reserve margins where they need to be? SCE just filed an integrated resource plan suggesting that we need reserve margins to go up to 17.5% by the time we get to 2026. So it's all of those things they build on today, but that planning framework for the future, I think that's going to be a really important element of the long term.
So Maria, it does sound that you agree that life of a utility CFO has become a little bit more complex in the last couple of years.
So, well, I would say that it's very interesting. And I'm sure that my colleagues would agree with that. There's never a lack of something new and different to think about or try and undertake, for sure.
Thanks. So we have one more question before we go to questions from the audience. Last question for all three, and I will start with you, Andrejka, and then move my way up here on the screen here. What are potential pitfalls that you see as new strategies and new investments in new technologies that are quite different from the ones that we made in the past are being made? What do you see as as the main, things that we have to overcome investing in these new technologies, new business models, new operating models?
I think it's a great question, Jan, and maybe I'll tag along, Maria and Drew's comments on investors. I think what's really important in solving resiliency is our ability to partner with the right investors. And I think both Drew and Maria, pointed out that the risk is changing, right? And so the return expectations are changing, the structures are changing of the deals. We now have customers that are involved in, participating on the monetization side, and so it's starting to get quite complex. And so I think that from a pitfalls perspective, I do think it's really important to partner with the right type of investors at the right time. I come from several other industries in my prior life, and we've seen obviously bubbles and then the falls in some other industries. And so I think it's going to be really important to pay attention to who is coming from investors' perspective into our space for the right reasons, understanding the risks, understanding the technologies. And so that's what I would say. I would focus on that piece, because I do see from our perspective, both on the private investor side as well as the public investor side, there's a lot of education that needs to be done, because there are a lot of new players that are entering the space. So that's what I see, as a sort of a, let's pay attention to that.
Thanks, Andrejka.
Who our partners are.
So Maria, same question for you. What do you see as the main pitfalls as you invest in new technologies, new solutions going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a pitfall, but it's a challenge, and I'm sure we can all rise to the challenge given the importance of what we're trying to accomplish. I think as we think about new technologies, one of the things we'll have to think about is how do we help educate even our regulators? New technologies may not have the same useful life that old technologies had, and how do you convey the cost-benefit analysis on something that could potentially be new and different? But for me, I think one of the most important things is going to be to have all policymakers, regulators, IOUs, other industries be working collaboratively and holistically across these issues. There's no one entity that's going to come up with the solution or make all of the investments that are necessary to achieve these outcomes. So we really have to make sure that we have coordinated policies, that each organization or each entity is actually building on the work of the other organizations and entities. To me, that's going to be really, really important, because we don't have, 2045 seems like, or 2050, for Drew, seems like a long time from now. But if we don't start hitting the mark in the near term, then, the hockey stick to get to the end is going to be very, very difficult. So I think it's this very much in the initial stages, making sure that you have everybody working together and pulling in the same direction, not because they don't want to, just but maybe because they're working at cross purposes. I think that's going to be really important.
Thanks, Maria. And Drew, as we line up for questions from the audience, last word for you. What do you see as challenges and potential pitfalls as we as an industry and you as Entergy invest in new technologies and solutions?
Well, I really like Maria's answer, and I think that part of getting to the regulatory solution, getting everybody to pull in the same direction, is going to be somehow solving that trifecta of reliability, affordability, and sustainability for the customer. And there's so much new technology out there today. Things are changing so much faster than they did in the past. Utilities finding a way to pivot and meet the customer's expectations along those three dimensions is going to be really, really important. And so I think that seems to be the real challenge for us, is sort of breaking with our past and finding new ways to serve our customers going forward. And that's a challenge and an opportunity, because it can open up new doors for us while we continue to frame it in traditional ways with the rate regulated model. We're excited about it.
Thanks, Drew. It definitely sounds really exciting and challenging at the same time. So thanks, Drew, Maria, Andrejka. You're not off the hook yet. We're going to take a live questions now from the audience.